Hello, I'd just like to mention that the resolution on this particular video isn't the best, but that was due to a firmware update and to the unfamiliarity with the equipment that was being used. So apologies in advance. Enjoy the show because it was a great event.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending this, the 10th monthly meeting of Swansea UFO Network and the first of the new year. Hope you enjoyed your Christmas break. Now, before we start, I'd very quickly like to touch on a few non-UFO related items by acknowledging a few of our members' achievements. Firstly, I'd like to thank our very own Emlyn Williams, sitting amongst you there, for the courage and passion he has shown in coming out as a cross-dresser. Now, for those of you who don't know what I mean, Emlyn delighted audiences in Gower over the new year by playing the dame in Sleeping Beauty. Apparently it was very well received and a complete success. Oh yes, it was. Some have said, mentioning no names, that he looked just a little too comfortable in his dress and makeup. And had he been abducted by aliens on his way home, they would have not known which type of probe to use on him. So well done, Emlyn.
Oh, yes, darling.
Secondly, not here tonight, but congratulations to Gaynor Vine on the publication of her new book. The book's entitled Down in the Valley, and it's available on Amazon for anyone who's interested. Makes you go from strength to strength in that. And lastly, by no means least, I don't want to embarrass him, which I'm not likely to do, hopefully, unless he's watching this video. I'd like to say congratulations to Stephen Griffiths on receiving his Unsung Heroes Award from Howard University Health Board, recognising his passionate and unfaltering commitment to carers in Carmarthen. So well done to him. Anyway, back to tonight. I have the pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker for the evening, which is Mr. Ben Emlyn Jones. Now, Ben was born in Aberystwyth and brought up in the Lampeter area before moving to Oxford, where up until 3 years ago he'd spent 22 well-respected years employed as a hospital porter at John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford. Ben became interested in UFOs and various other conspiracy theories in the late 1990s. He started his website blog, Hospital Porters Against the New World Order, in 2006, I believe, and it has thousands of visitors every day. He regularly attends and delivers talks and discussions all over Britain on a wide range of subjects. His talk this evening is entitled Energy, Politics and UFOs. Now, he's travelled a good distance today to be with us this evening, so without further ado, please give a warm Sufon welcome to Mr. Ben Emlyn Jones.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Can you all hear me? Thanks for that. Just start this up. I'm making a little audio recording here. It's okay. It's nothing. This is not being videoed. We've got a separate video being made. All right. Are there any hospital porters here this evening? No. I'm at the wrong meeting. Oh dear. Yeah. Fe alla I siarad Cymraeg ond dim yn dda iawn nawr meddyl I. No, I can't speak Welsh very well. I'm rusty as hell now. I used to. I've got a family who can speak it, why I never see. But my name is Ben Emlyn Jones, and I am an ex-hospital porter, as you just heard. And I do hail from Wales originally, but my accent is east of the border, as you can tell. I've lost my accent in the intervening years, but I still feel like a Welsh boy. In fact, I've got something more appropriate to wear than this. There we go. I'm not going to do the full Monty, don't worry. There we go. Yeah, that's better, isn't it? That's more like it. Let's have another Grand Slam this year, shall we? Yay. Yes, so next slide, please, Mike. Thanks very much. This was me, the porter in Buddha. I was a hospital porter for 23 years and lost my job in rather mysterious circumstances, which I can't really detail this evening, but it was suspicious, and I think it was related to what I'm doing now. I'm one of several people who has had these experiences in their employment and through their career, which really does kind of make it a little bit suspicious, makes it a little bit... I think people should be asking serious questions when more than one person suffers through their employment in this way. But as luck would have it, or Providence, I'm still in my... I've got a roof over and I've got food on, basically, so I can't complain. I've got another job and things are going well, so and because the hospital and the NHS generally is so stressful now, I miss it less and less every minute. I really do, so maybe it was for the best. But you sure there's no hospital porters? I'm on the wrong meeting. No, not to worry, not to worry. I'll hang around for a bit. But basically, what I'm here to talk to you about today is, of course, energy politics and UFOs. And you might think it can't possibly be a connection between those disparate items. They're two entirely different subjects. How do they possibly coalesce? Well, they do. And I will explain, but it's a long way round, and it will take a while to get through all the details. But it's important to understand the details before you can understand what's going on in the world. Now, can I have the next slide, please? So what is a UFO? Well, a UFO stands for Unidentified Flying Objects, as you well know in this group, because you've studied them carefully. Basically, anything you see in the sky which you do not recognise is by definition a UFO, Unidentified Flying Object. This could be an unusual bird of a species you're not familiar with. It could be a kite. It could be a foreign aircraft of a design you're not familiar with, etc., etc. Now, the official line is that basically all these things are explicable, and they would be if everyone could just get a bit closer and see what they were. Now, obviously, in many cases, maybe the majority of cases, of course, people are mistaken. They mistake mundane, everyday objects for things, and they just think, "What's that?" And they don't know what it is. But if maybe in different circumstances, they would know what it is. But I believe it is false. I'll say that from the start. I believe it is false to suggest that all unidentified flying object experiences can be explained thus. And I'm sure that having an interest in this subject, you will have come to a similar conclusion. But there's all kinds of different UFOs. Some people see them very close. This is one of the most common varieties. It is a saucer. It is the original flying saucer, a disc-shaped object. These are seen quite commonly. Next slide, please. This is another common variety. It is a triangular-shaped object with lights on the corner. Very often these do have lights on the corners. Very often they're black in colour. They're sometimes seen in local areas, for instance the north of England and in Belgium. There was a wide range of sightings of these across Belgium in the 1989 to 1990. This is a photograph taken of one in Belgium in 1990. Next slide, please. This is another familiar type of object. It is a spherical object. I've actually seen one of these myself, not up close like this. This is actually an artist's impression of a real-life encounter that took place in Scotland in 1979. A man called Robert Taylor was walking through the woods one day, and he came across this. And he didn't only see it, it actually ripped his trousers. It actually went for him and ripped his trousers. And I've seen those trousers. I put my fingers through the holes made by this strange object. So that's another common form. The next slide, please. This is a triangular shaped or pyramidal object, different from the black triangle. This is like a solid tetrahedron or pyramid. A tetrahedron is like a pyramid with a triangular base, so it's triangles on four sides. And this is an artist's impression of one seen at Rendlesham Forest in 1980, the very famous incident in which a group of American airmen, many witnesses, encountered strange things in the woods. It's one of the most famous sightings of all times. Next slide, please. This is a chevron-shaped object, which was seen. It's basically similar to the one seen over Phoenix, Arizona in 1997. Contrary to what you might have heard, they weren't just flares, they weren't just warning flares. There was a solid object, very large, that flew over the city of Phoenix, a city of 1 million people in Arizona, USA. Next slide, please. And it seems that weather balloons are fitted with rhubars these days. This infamous or famous headline from The Sun is, well, basically, this happened in Lincolnshire, where a wind turbine suffered an accident. It was struck by some object, and no one knows exactly what it was, but it was big enough to knock the hell out of it and break one of the blades and bend another one. So it was quite remarkable incident, that, and that still remains unsolved. There's been many other strange goings on in Lincolnshire, including sheep being stolen and similar things, strange lights being seen in the sky, etc. Next slide, please. Of course, when I describe UFOs, you'll often hear me use the word artifact. I don't often use words like spaceship, spacecraft, etc., even though that might be accurate in many cases. Artifact is a bit more wide-ranging because it may be a bit of an assumption to say things like spaceship or spacecraft. Artifact is more, it implies an artificially created object, which is not terrestrial, it's not made by humans. But it's quite clear that these objects do appear to function as some kind of transportation device for biological beings of some kind or another. And this is one of the most common, the iconic grey, with the black eyes, short creature, hairless, grey body. This is one of the most commonly seen and regularly encountered by witnesses. Next slide. And these are a bit different. They're more human looking, these actually. These are the Nordics. They're the kind of aliens you could almost pass in the street and not really look at them if they were wearing normal clothes. You might just think, oh, they're a bit strange, but you wouldn't react the same way as you did if you saw one of the greys. They tend to have very bright blonde hair and deep blue eyes. They often have exaggerated features like extra large eyes and extra long chin, things like that. Next slide, please. Now this is an artist's impression of a creature seen by a guy called Whitley Strieber in the United States. Whitley Strieber was an author, used to write books on various kinds of things, and then he had an amazing encounter with several encounters with a creature like this, and after that he decided to write about his experiences, and he's written a book called Communion, which was made into an excellent film starring Christopher Walken. Eric Clapton did the score. It's very well worth seeing. Next slide, please. This is a reptilian humanoid. Now this is another creature very often seen by witnesses. These creatures tend to be often more likely associated with unpleasant encounters. The brilliant Australian researcher Mary Rodwell has looked into all kinds of alien contact experiences throughout her career, and that's what she has noted. These are like a human. They tend to be a bit short, bit taller than an average man, and reptilian in features. In other words, they have scaly skin, lizard-like eyes, etc., and things like that. You'll hear a lot about these if you look into the works of people like David Icke, because these apparently, he talks about reptilian humanoids that can disguise themselves as humans, and I'll go into a bit more detail about that later in the talk, but it's not necessarily the same phenomenon we're dealing with here. There may be something different. Next slide, please. Now this is what's known as a mantid, and these are large, tall creatures that look fearsome, but they're very often quite benevolent. I should point out that aliens, whatever you want to call them, some people have encounters with them which are very loving and benevolent. These creatures are sometimes quite spiritual, and they're almost like spiritual gurus who want to help us evolve on an etheric level. Others seem to be disinterested. The majority seem to be quite disinterested and neutral towards us, and they appear to be almost studying us as a scientist might study an animal in a laboratory. Those seem to be the majority. There are some, and luckily it is a minority, which appear to have a dark agenda. They appear to be very, very hateful and very malevolent, and they wish to inflict pain on us, and they do inflict injuries on people. There's several people who've died, and their deaths have been associated with contact with extraterrestrials. So the extraterrestrials they exhibit a very, very wide array of behaviours, and they seem to have a lot of different motives and agendas. So I never go along with people who claim that the same agenda can be applied to all extraterrestrials, because I don't believe that's the case. But I mean, very often people have encounters with these. There's a famous witness who's been on TV lately talking about how he's actually married to one of these creatures in the spaceship. He has like a second wife. It's a bit awkward because he has a wife in this world and a family, but he does meet up with his wife on the spacecraft, his other wife, and they. I can't imagine begin to imagine what his home life is like, what his family life is like. But all kinds of weird, wonderful creatures, every variety you can imagine. Next slide, please. You can't imagine the kind of strange creatures you sometimes come across in these various encounters, and I don't. What the hell is that doing there? Dear me. Nick Pope, bless him. Do you know about Nick Pope? Nick Pope got married to a human woman. But apparently, I think she's human anyway. But didn't go very well at first, because he was standing in front of the altar beside her, and the vicar says, "Nicholas, do you take this woman, Elizabeth, to be your lawful wedded wife, to love and cherish, to hold for this day forward till death do you part?" Nick replied, "I can neither confirm nor deny that." Okay, that's enough Nick Popery. I'm not a Nick Papist. Next slide, please. Now, this is a picture of my own encounter. I was going to say artist impression, but it's not really accurate, is it? I was walking through Oxford and I saw a white spherical object at a distance. Its apparent size was about the size of a quarter of the size of the moon, and it was. I never worked out exactly how big it was, but it must have been some size because a cloud passed in front of it at an elevation of about like that sort of elevation. So it must have been some considerable size, and I did look into it and try to eliminate the obvious things, like I checked to see if there were any balloons flying that day, any balloon sagas. Well, this was just before New Year, so it was unlikely, and it's a very windy day. This thing was just standing still in the sky, even though there's a very strong wind blowing. But that I thought was very strange, and I did report it to Nick Pope's UFO desk, so I'm looking forward to reading about my report in the recently declassified files. Anyway, next slide, please. Now we're going to go to energy. Now, I hope you've got lots of it tonight. But what is energy? We all sort of know what it means, but how do you define it? Well, it's very difficult to actually define, even for experts. You know, they'll sort of and ah, but it's basically it's an observed quantity of the universe. It is essentially something that causes change and adaptation, or any kind of change or alteration of the universe requires energy. But it can't be defined. Even people like Professor Brian Cox, these experts they got on TV. He goes, "I don't really know. I'm very handsome and very clever, but I don't know what energy is." They have to admit, these experts, that they're not experts in that respect. There's different kinds of energy, and of course our bodies produce energy. Our bodies produce energy from the food we eat, which we combust inside us. It's combustion. It's the same chemical reaction you get from fire, because the various carbon, hydrocarbons and things in our food are mixed with we breathe oxygen, and this releases energy. And it's for our muscles. If I have my arm like that, I've got my arm up like that, requires energy for me to hold my arm in that position. The muscles are burning literally the food I eat, the energy from the food I eat, into energy which allows me to overcome the force of gravity to hold my arm at that angle. I shouldn't do that, really, should I? Sorry, wrong meeting again. But that's muscle power is basically is a part of how that works. Next slide, please. Now, energy. There's other forms of energy, of course. That is artificial energy that we get from sources outside our bodies, which we actually burn outside our bodies in machines. And this could be something as simple as a campfire, and something as complicated as a space rocket. But it's essentially the same thing. We're taking energy from the environment and processing it through combustion to release the energy. And there's other reactions, of course, like nuclear reactions, which I'll come to as well, which also release energy. But this is basically how. This is basically the majority of the energy we have in our society. This is the energy which we burn outside our body. Comes from oil, and in the modern world, and for the last century or more, it comes from oil. And oil is obtained from underground. It is drilled. For this oil rig, this is an oil rig from the North Sea. It is drilling the vast oil reserves from deep below the seabed, which were laid down billions of years ago or millions of years ago by animal life. And that's a contentious issue I'm going to come on to. All right. So I may sometimes say things this evening which I won't necessarily agree with, and I'll make you aware that there is another side to the story. But I might just mention it for convenience's sake, or just to tell a certain part of the story. But yeah, energy is everything. Energy is they call it black gold, and it is oil. The oil industry covers almost everything in terms of our civilization. And everything is run off oil. It's been described as the world's biggest industry. I would say it's not. It is industry. Oil is industry. It is the lifeblood of civilization, but it's the fuel and it's the lubricant. It is everything when it comes to civilization, because nearly all our fuel comes from it. We also, of course, have other forms which I'm going to talk about. Coal is another one. We burn coal. In olden times, we didn't have oil really, and we had vehicles that were powered by coal in terms of steam engines, steam railways, and things like that. Now, those kinds of vehicles, that kind of work is done by oil-powered vehicles, oil-powered machines. Now, next slide, please. This is an oil pump that is on land. This is what's known as a nodding donkey, and it is actually doing a similar job to the oil rig you just saw, but except it's on land. And the thing about oil is we often think of the fact there's oil down there and all we have to do is get it up. It's not quite that simple. The oil has to come up, which means it has to be under pressure. In a sense, the ground itself is squeezing the oil up, because in order to suck the oil up, you would have to have a pump and pump it up. The thing is, you'd need more energy in some cases to run the pump than you'd actually get from the oil you extract. At that point, when that point is reached, that oil well becomes useless. It becomes spent and it's abandoned. So again, there's been some issues where oil wells have been left alone for 20 years and people come back to them and there's pressure again. That goes into the realm of abiotic oil, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But assuming at the moment this is a fossil fuel, it's a finite resource. It was laid down millions and billions of years ago by fossils, by microbial life which died. Then, in which case, it's not going to last forever. It's not going to run out altogether. I mean, when humans are no longer able to use oil, there'll still be plenty of it left in the ground. It'll just be in a state, maybe too deep, or without enough pressure, or in areas that we can't access it. Or it costs too much money. It costs us too much money too much energy to actually extract the oil for us to actually get a net gain from the oil itself that we extract. Now, next slide, please. This is a factory. It's the cipher of the Industrial Revolution. The big mass urban factory which is run off coal, oil and any kind of energy you can imagine to produce things which our civilization needs. And as you can see, it's got a big cloud of black smoke coming out of it, and that's the downside of the use of fossil fuels, which I'll talk more about in a little while. Next slide, please. There are alternatives. There are other forms of energy which people use, and this is one of them. Wind turbines. This is one of the most common. It's very common, often used in this country since it's so windy, like tonight. But wind turbines have a disadvantage, and like a lot of these alternative energy sources, even though the power to generate electricity is very simple. It's basically a big dynamo run by a big windmill, and that generates electricity. But these things are complicated to build. They have a lot of overheads. They need a lot of maintenance, and they don't last. They often need repairing. When the wind gets too high, they often burn out and they catch fire, and sometimes they're struck by UFOs as well, as we've seen. So it's not easy to run a grid off wind turbines. So very often some people are saying that these are not suitable for every part of the world. Next slide, please. This is a very important man in this story, and the things he has said are an important part of analysing what we're going to talk about this evening. This is Richard Heinberg. Richard Heinberg is a journalist, a teacher, an ecologist, and futurologist. And he's written a book called "The Party's Over." Great title, that, isn't it? It's a great title. Yeah, he says basically that the age of oil is coming to an end because it's no longer really possible to extract oil. There's not enough oil left for us to extract and to use. Well, there's going to be a point where we won't be able to anymore. And what he's referring to is what's known as peak oil. What happens is that the oil production has been rising as new wells are discovered and they're being extracted. More and more oil is being extracted. What he's saying is that of course is finite. And he says that sooner or later we're going to reach a point where we can't actually. There's no more new oil wells to find that are usable, which have viable pressure, which we can actually tap. What's going to happen before then is there'll be a peak in production. There'll be a peak when the rise in the production of oil is going to stop and it's going to turn downwards, and from then onwards there's going to be decline in oil production. And he doesn't know exactly when that peak will occur. He claims it's occurring around about now. Some people say it happened a few years ago. Some people say it's not going to happen until 2025, etc., etc. So we're not sure. Is that the girl I met in the pub earlier? Tell her I'll call her back. When that happens, it's kind of a perfect storm from his perspective, because at the same time oil demand and the need for oil is rising because the world is developing. Countries in the third world are becoming more developed. They're bringing in more. They need more energy because they have a bit of a bigger infrastructure, more developed and sophisticated technological and social infrastructure. And you'll hear words like that. Word infrastructure is a bit of a buzzword, and you'll hear me say it several times tonight because it is a part of this tale. Now, Heimberg, his book is very interesting because at one point he compares our civilization to yeast. Because as you know, if you do any brewing at home, which I expect some of you do now with the price of beer in the pub going up, you actually have a solution of sugar and various other substances which you then add yeast to, and the yeast consumes the sugar to the point where you actually have a nice pint or glass of wine or whatever it is full of alcohol which has been produced by this yeast, and then the yeast dies and it sinks to the bottom and you get this slime on the bottom. And Heimberg puts it very pithily actually. He has a big statement on the page which says, "Are human beings more intelligent than yeast?" You wouldn't be a very good dinner guest, this guy. You really wouldn't. He'd put you off your food. But yeah, he says basically that's what we're doing. We're like the yeast, consuming the sugar at a voracious rate. We're not rationing ourselves. We just eat through it. Sooner or later it'll be gone, and then we'll be like the yeast. We'll just die. Now, I don't agree with Richard Heimberg. That's important, and I'll explain why this evening. I think he's wrong on most things in several different ways, and I'll explain why he is. But in order to grasp this subject, it's important to see the issue through his eyes. You have to understand his point in order to actually understand his points in order to see exactly the mistakes he's made. Is this running? Yes, it is good. Right. So next slide, please. Now, Richard Heimberg has a vision of the past, and he explains how civilization developed from the earliest times. And as I've explained, to begin with, humans basically, for most of our history, now humans have been around for a long time, at least 100,000 years. We've got a common ancestor which everyone in the world shares, which lived 100,000 years ago. That was a modern human like ourselves. Some people say we've been around much older, we've been around much longer, that we shared the world with dinosaurs, etc. But I watched that on Fred Flintstone, so it must be true. But basically, that's another contentious issue, and I'm not going to go there tonight. And also, of course, how you define human, because, of course, before modern humans, there were Neanderthal man, and then there was the Homo erectus, etc. But I'll go along with what Heimberg's vision is, because Heimberg describes this process as well. For nearly all of our history, our only energy source was muscle power, our own muscles, bodily strength, as I told you, as I explained in the beginning. We moved things, we pushed, pulled, carried, dragged, and that's it. There were a few exceptions. For instance, we lit wood fires to cook meals and things like that, but apart from that, all our energy came from our own bodies, from the food we ate and how we transferred that into motion, which is the opposite, of course, what a wind turbine does. Next slide, please. Oh, sure, I'll go back, sorry mate, sorry. Now, this picture, I should point out this picture. This is a picture of the Egyptian pyramids being built. Now, according to official history, the pyramids were built by people using primitive technology. They didn't have the lever, the pulley, the wheel, or anything like that. They had bronze tools, they had stone tools, and they dragged these blocks around. Now, this is what you see illustrated here. Now, I know a lot of people who've studied Egypt and studied the pyramids and these other monuments don't agree with that, and I can understand their points. I do understand that there are big questions we've got to ask in that respect. So, but for now, we're just going to assume that that's the case. Right, next slide. Now, a big revolution occurred sometime in the Neolithic age when we learned to domesticate animals. We actually we basically got animals. We persuaded animals to live with us and work with us, and we could use them for many different things, including their much greater strength. Now, this here is I think it's a donkey or a mule here in Egypt, and the donkey, of course, is one of the oldest beasts of burden, which has been around for a long time. And this donkey, of course, is making itself very useful because it's pulling this big cart full of vegetable matter. And because the donkey's very strong, the donkey's probably as strong as about 4 big men. So it'll do the same work as 4 big guys. So basically, just one person, the farmer, can sit on that, and then the donkey can pull the cart. Otherwise, he'd have to pull it himself, which he wouldn't be able to do, or he'd have to get 3 of his friends to help him. So that gives you an illustration of how useful it is to domesticate beasts of burden. Next slide, please. Of course, donkeys are not the only animals that we've domesticated and we use for transportation and for labour. The camel, for example. This is another photograph, also taken in Egypt, of camels. Camels are even bigger and stronger than donkeys, and they have the advantages that they can go places donkeys can't, because they are adapted for the dry, hot climate of desert, and they're known as the ship of the desert. And even in this day and age, if you want to get across a desert, the back of a camel is the best way. This camel will take you a very long distance. It doesn't need to stop for a drink. It can go 6 months without a drink. It will take you across the desert. Whereas if you try to do the same journey with a donkey, the donkey will be dead within 10 miles. So that's another example of domesticating animals. Next slide, please. Here, this is a picture taken in South America, and you can see here is a mule pulling a plough. And again, you have an idea of how domesticating animals helped in agriculture. Today we use machines very often to do this, like tractors, which are oil-powered, and that's very important. I'll come to that. This mule, of course, is not oil-powered, and these people are sticking to their traditional farming methods. And as you can see, this mule has the power to pull the plough through the soil, and the man standing on it guiding it. You need 20 people probably to do that sort of job, to pull it along. Some slave states in the ancient world did use people to do things like this, but you need an awful lot of food, you need an awful lot of drink and water to keep them going. So it gives you an example of how more efficient it is to use animals for things like that. Next slide, please. Then everything changed. Yes. About 200 years ago, the world changed completely. We hit the Industrial Revolution, and it came around in different countries at different times. Britain was where it actually started, right here. In South Wales, you played a vital role, because all through the 19th century, the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, the industrial era, South Wales was the equivalent of the Persian Gulf in the 20th century, because that's where I think more than half the world's coal came from, South Wales. So we started off with coal, a lot of it from this area, from other parts of the world as well, and that was the fuel of the first phase of industrial society. The Industrial Revolution just took a few decades, which in historical terms, in terms of the whole world, is the blink of an eye. It happened very, very quickly. We had factories springing up everywhere, creating goods, creating all kinds of things that we never could have before, all run off fossil fuels, all run off this new coal, this new fossil fuel. Now, we went almost instantaneously from a world of mere human and animal muscle power to an energy source that was 100 or 1,000 times more effective, more compact, and more full of energy. You're more able to use the amount of energy you're able to use. And Heinberg illustrates it very well. He says, if you want to know the difference that it made when we started using fossil fuels compared to what we had before with muscle power, get in your car, drive 10 miles from home, then stop the engine and push the car back. Push the car home. It would take you days to push that car home, if you could even do it at all. Yet you can travel 10 miles, depending on traffic, in half an hour just by turning a wheel and pressing a pedal. All that energy, that massive amount of energy your body, or even a horse would have trouble with, is there at your disposal, at a flick of a switch and turn of a key. It's actually, believe it or not, your car, a family car, has about the same horsepower as a Roman galley. Remember the Roman galleys were their slaves. It's amazing to think of that, isn't it? That's how compact this energy source is. A tank of petrol, that big. You fill it up, and you have the equivalent of 200 galley slaves, 200 Ben-Hurs, all sitting there going, that's in your car petrol tank. That's miraculous for people who lived before the age of fossil fuels. That's a miraculous energy source. And our entire world is constructed on this foundation of this energy supply. And of course, it's not only fossil fuels. People will say, I've had people actually say to me, well, we don't just use fossil fuels, we have electricity. But where does the electricity come from? In this country, it very often comes from coal and gas-fired power stations. More gas now, and I'll come to that in a minute. The change over from coal to gas is very important. But it comes from fossil fuels. And electricity is not an energy source. Electricity is a way of moving energy from one place to another. The energy is created at the power station, it charges the national grid, and it comes into these lights. Now the next slide, please. Now this is the downside, though, to fossil fuel use. It's the downside to our energy source. That is environmental destruction. Do you remember the picture of the factory I showed you with massive amounts of smoke coming out of its chimney? That's what we see. We see that smoke goes into the environment. It goes into the ground, it goes into the soil, it goes into the water, it goes into our bodies. These are very often toxic chemicals released from the burning of coal and other substances, and oil too releases this soot. That is very, very it's very, very toxic. Now, you'll hear an awful lot about carbon dioxide. Now, you may question that. We see carbon dioxide is very dangerous because it's causing climate change. That's kind of a side issue. It's one that I don't personally go along with myself. I know a lot of other people who don't. Some people do. It's irrelevant right now. The fact of the matter is, though, even if you don't believe that carbon dioxide is a dangerous gas to emit, the other things that burning fossil fuels are dangerous, and that is why we should stop. This is why burning fossil fuels is so destructive. And here we have a devastated forest. The forest was devastated because this particular forest was cleared in order to create farmland. The farming method is basically it's the kind of farming that is intimately tied to the use of fossil fuels, as I'll explain, because our farms, believe it or not, are dependent on fossil fuels. We have a certain, and I mentioned tractors earlier on because we have tractors rather than horses now to pull ploughs and things like that. Not only that, but oil actually is used for industrial chemicals and things like that, agricultural chemicals as well. And this is you'll hear about this. This is another buzzword you'll hear an awful lot. Unsustainable. That's another. You'll hear that very, very often. Unsustainable. This is an unsustainable situation, and it depletes resources. It depletes other kinds of resources. The use of fossil fuels. Now, the idea that oil might not be a fossil fuel, I should touch on. There's a guy called Ian R. Crane. He's very, very interesting. He talks about this, the possibility that oil might actually not be a fossil fuel, and it actually replenishes itself. It regrows. It's something that actually it grows almost like a plant. And basically, in Russia, it's a kind of open secret because it's in Russia that they leave the oil wells alone for 20 years and they come back. Oh, pardon me. They come back later, and the oil is replenished. The pressure's back. Of course, if that ever became known, the price would go through the floor. The price of oil would plummet. And interestingly, the current oil price is very low at the moment. It's the lowest it's been for years, and I think it's to do with an attempt to sabotage the Russian economy of all countries. They're targeting Russia for some reason. That's a big subject. I can't cover that in detail. But that's basically why they do it. And the control, as I said, there is a suppression of information like this, and it comes from the fact that the flow of energy and the distribution of energy is a vital tool for political reasons, which I'll describe. And next slide, please. This here is a oil rig burning in the Gulf of Mexico. This is the Deepwater Horizon oil rig. It was caught fire in 2010 and has created one of the worst environmental disasters in history in the Gulf of Mexico. It destroyed a 500-year-old sustainable fishing industry and has poisoned, it's destroyed the tourist industry, and it's caused devastation to the local wildlife. Never eat fish that comes from the Gulf of Mexico now. Ian R. Crane has talked a lot about this particular issue as well, this subject as well. He believes this was done deliberately, and that's perfectly possible. But what happened was this, by accidental design, this Deepwater Horizon oil rig caught fire and exploded. This is a very different. This is an oil rig of a very different type to the one I showed you earlier, which is the one in the North Sea. Because this one is in much deeper water. It drills down into water that's maybe several thousand feet deep, rather than the one in the North Sea, which is several hundred feet deep. So what's happening is the depletion of various easy-to-get oil in shallow waters or on land is causing the oil industry to need to move further out. As Heinberg explains, Heinberg doesn't mention this particular. His book was written before this happened, but this is the kind of thing he talks about. So, in that next slide, please. Fracking. Now, this is very, very topical indeed, and this is a speciality of Ian R. Crane as well. He's an anti-fracking campaigner. Didcot Power Station in Oxfordshire, which is close to where I live, is one of the biggest power stations on the national grid. The national grid, of course, is basically it's a network of electric wires and cables and pylons that includes all the wires leading up to, for instance, the light there, or these plug sockets, and it covers the entire country. And the power stations are at odd points along the grid, charge the national grid at various places. Now, the national grid is wasteful because the energy is generated so far from where the work is. You lose a lot from resistance. The wires are copper because that's a low resistance metal, but a lot of the power is lost to resistance because of the size of the circuit. If one power station fails, it means that the rest of the national grid can compensate. It can keep charging, but obviously if more power stations fail, then the national grid goes down. But coming back to fracking, this local power station, there's two, there's Didcot A and Didcot B, and one of them, Didcot A I think, has recently completely switched from coal to gas. It's a natural gas fired power station, and the reason it's done that has got a lot to do with fracking, this process of extracting natural gas from places where it was not able to before. It's done by drilling a hole down to where there's coal bed methane or shale. There's then explosions set off to crack the pipe, and then high pressure water mixed with sand and various chemicals, which they won't tell us what's in the chemicals, are pushed down at very high pressure, which splits the rocks apart and lets the gas bubbles out. Now, that's very, very hazardous because some of the gas leaks out into the environment, and the industry will tell you it doesn't because they drill down 12,000 feet. They say it's that deep, it won't make its way up to the surface, but it does. It's been detected in drinking water, in the air, everywhere, and it leaks out of the well higher up as well. And the chemicals get up. No one knows what's in these chemicals, but they rise as well. And it's all to do with extracting natural gas down there. And the government, they're so determined to do this, they've lied about even the amount of gas that's in the wells, because there's only a fraction of the gas that they say is there anyway. So why they've done that, well, Ian talks about that in detail in his lecture. But basically, it's a big bubble. And next slide, please. This is another form of energy, an unconventional oil source. This is tar sands. in this particular tar sands pit is in Canada, and it sounds like what it says it is. It's basically sand mixed with tar, from which you can extract hydrocarbons to burn. It's an unconventional oil source. You can actually make usable oil out of this. The only problem is that this is a huge, dirty, dangerous place. These little strips here, they're not paths which people walk along. They're big roads where massive dumper trucks drive along. This is several miles across this tar sand pit, and when birds land on it, they get oil on their feathers and they die. It's an eyesore. It must be a nose sore as well, because people tell me it smells really bad. But that's another example of how the oil industry and the need for energy is pushing people into destructive and really, really unwise, which would otherwise be very, very unwise means of obtaining oil. Can I have the next slide, please? And of course, all this has to be paid for. It is expensive. It costs money to drill for oil, to mine coal, to transport them, to refine them. It's a complex process that needs millions of man hours. And so that's why you have energy bills. And energy bills are now so high that a lot of people are having real trouble paying them. People I know are having trouble paying them. And I mean, is there anyone in this room who hasn't noticed their energy bill rising over the last 20 years or so? No one? Because honestly, they seem to be going up all over the place. And a lot of people can't afford it. And there's people in some countries where very few people can afford this energy, and they fall into poverty. We call those countries the third world, or developing nations, as the euphemism goes. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of this is part of the national grid. These big metal giants which lie across the countryside, dragging these wires behind them, ruining the view. There's thousands and thousands of miles of these across the country, taking this energy from on the national grid to various places. Wasteful, as I said, and with all the other disadvantages that I talk about. So yeah, this all, there's said to be health conditions associated with these. There's been several accidents involved with these things. When some kids try to climb them. I tried to do this when I was a little kid. It was silly of me. Some people climb them, they get electrocuted. Sometimes there's also several reports that state that people who live close to these are more likely to get certain kinds of cancer. If one of these is going over your house, for example, it's something to be concerned about. So next slide, please. Now, this graph illustrates, or this series of graphs illustrates the kind of thing that Heimberg talks about. This is the one that I drew myself. It's very, very simple. On the vertical axis, there's quantity. On the horizontal axis, it's time. There's no figures on these. It's all qualitative. It's all just general. There's no particular figures, except, as you can see on the time axis, I've put past, present, and future, and that's all you need to know. This is not about exact measurement. This is simply illustration. So this is all qualitative and inexact. But basically, as I said earlier, for most of our history, there were very, very few people in the world compared to what we have now. There were less than. It's interesting. There were less than 1 billion people for most of the time we were around. At one point, someone said there was like about 1 million people in the world. We went through a real bottleneck at some point. We only reached 1 billion people actually in the year 1800, at the start of the Industrial Revolution. But so for most of our, we were just this little line at the bottom, this small group of animals, this small species cluster. And of course our energy production was very low as well, because we had, like I say, this red line illustrates the amount of energy capability, energy availability, resources available for energy use. And that of course was also very low, because as I've explained, we had muscle power only, we had beasts of burden, we had various domesticated animals, and we could light fires, wood fires and things like that. So there was no industry, but this is before industry. Next slide, please. And then suddenly, the amount of energy available to us shot up, and as you see just before the present day I put on here, illustrating the start of the Industrial Revolution. Our energy supply increased 1,000-fold with the industrialised mass infrastructure of fossil fuel use. Next slide please. And as a result our population shot up. As I said, by 1800 there were about 1 billion people in the world. That's less than the population of India today, and we now have 7.5 billion. So it's increased enormously. The start of the Industrial Revolution led to a population explosion with increased energy. Basically, it took all of human history for us to reach 1 billion people by 1800. But by 1900 we hit 2 billion. So we doubled in size within a century because of the Industrial Revolution. Next slide please. We're back in prehistory, but in the pre-industrial age now. As you can see, the green line there represents resources. Resources are what's sometimes known as the natural capital, or the bioeconomic capital of planet Earth. This includes oil and fossil fuels, but also soil, nutrients, food, water, air, everything. Everything that we need or everything the planet's life on Earth needs, which is the same thing in terms of those resources. Next slide please. With the Industrial Revolution, with the increase in production, the increase in energy availability and use, the increase in population, the resources started to go down. We started to eat into the natural capital of the world. As Heinberg puts it, he says we treat the natural capital as an income, and we just spend, and like the yeast, we're eventually going to run out. Next slide please. Now, we're back in prehistory again, and you can see here there was a grey line at the bottom. I'm not keeping... How long have I been talking for? Anyone keeping time?
50 minutes.
Have I been good for 50?
Yeah,
50?
Yeah.
Right, let me just do this bit and then we'll have a little break. The bottom there, you see, that grey line represents environmental destruction. That means habitat loss, the poisoning of the air, the poisoning of the oceans, rubbish tips replacing green forests, things like that. All kinds of things. Every time like a motorway is built, it goes through a forest. That adds to environmental destruction. As you can see, it's very, very low here. Until maybe someone might light an open fire underneath a tree, and the tree might get its leaves singed, something like that. That was a limit of environmental destruction in those days. Next slide, please. And of course, as you probably know and predict by now, with the rise in population, the rise in energy, the depletion of resources, environmental destruction started to rise, and you know all about that because you hear about it all the time. Next slide, please. So now in the present day, we've reached a point really which Heinberg considers to be the perfect storm. Increasing population, increasing energy, increasing demand for energy, increasing environmental destruction, and the sapping of resources at the point where they're almost gone, and we're continuing to increase. It's like he says, "Oh, I despair," because we're acting as if the resources are infinite when they're not. Next slide, please. And here, of course, we have here the power stations, the coal, the energy that's being generated, and everything that goes with it, which is all part of this. This is almost the centre of this entire, the core of this entire system. Next slide, please. Now, what are the alternatives? That's the question. Maybe I'll tell you what. I'll take a little break, and then we'll talk about alternatives to what we've seen just now. All right. Now, if you're feeling a bit down, don't worry, because this does have a happy ending. All right. I'm going to cheer. There's some cheerful news coming up. Okay. But go and get yourself a beer or a drink, and I'll see you in how long? Okay. Yeah, 15. Bear in mind, I've got some books for sale here. These are just £5 each, these books, despite their size. This is a book I published. It's by me, and I wrote it and published it in 2002. It's called Evans Land, and it's not about the subjects I'm talking about now, but it's about Wales. I thought you might like it because it's kind of a science fiction story set in Wales. So if you want one of those, let me know and take one of these, and they're just £5 each. They're on remainder prices now because that book's been around for a long time. Okay, thanks very much.
We are asking for donations tonight.